If you were considering to buy an RTX 4070 graphics card, you're probably looking at more affordable models that will cost you around $600 in the US or about 660 euros here in the EU, which is NVIDIA's recommended retail price for this chip. But unfortunately, most manufacturers usually only send those fancier models to reviewers because they want to get the best results, they want to look the best with all the RGB lights, and they want to have the coolest or the quietest option on the market, while these simpler models are often being overlooked. And keep in mind, getting a good value is the most important thing for this mid-tier chip. So I decided to get my hands on several entry-level 4070 models, and in this video we're going to see how these cards compare to each other and which one is the best one to get. So let's begin. The first model I'm going to talk about is the Gigabyte Windforce OC. It does have a 3-fan design, but it uses smaller 18mm fans, so it is actually pretty compact. 261mm long and about 50mm thick, which is a bit more than 2 slots. It has a pretty simple black design with a couple of lines here and there, but nothing that really stands out. And you do get a nice metal backplate, which does make it look and feel like a decent graphics card. And keep in mind, there is absolutely nothing wrong with a simple design because lower tier cooler designs should primarily be functional, not overdone. Power comes from a single 8-pin connector, and you get 3 display ports and 1 HDMI 2.1 port in the back. You don't get much when it comes to extra features, so there is no RGB and no dual BIOS, but you do get a fan stop feature. So the fans will stop in idle and when they have very little to do, which goes for most cards these days. Next on the list is the ASUS Dual OC. This is a dual fan model, but with 100mm fans this time around. It actually ended up slightly longer and slightly wider than the Gigabyte card. 267mm though will still easily fit most cases on the market. In terms of looks, I think the ASUS stands out a little bit more with some smaller details here and there, but it is still a pretty straightforward and simple GPU with a nice plastic shroud and a pretty decent metal backplate. It also uses a single 8-pin power connector and has the same 3 display port and 1 HDMI port layout in the back. There is no RGB present, but you do get a dual BIOS switch on this one, which allows you to swap between a performance and a quiet profile. Now, I tested both, and I will talk about those results a bit later in this video. There is also a dual non-OC version available, but both the OC and the non-OC sell for the same base MSRP, so you might as well just get the overclocked one. And the last card is the Ventus 3X OC from MSI, and I would say that this one is a little bit different in several ways. It uses 3 90mm fans, which makes it a lot longer than the other two, ending up with a length of 308mm, but at 43mm it is also thinner than the other two, keeping it nicely within 2 slots. They've also worked in a bit of a silver gray color to the design, which can look really great, depending on your motherboard choice, of course. Now, unfortunately, they did not go for a metal backplate, but decided to use some sort of plastic instead. Now, functionally, it adds very little, and to be honest, it could even trap a bit of heat. And even though this shouldn't matter that much on a 200-watt chip, it does seem a bit disappointing because the competitors are all using metal backplates while costing the same. You can also feel that difference in weight. The Gigabyte and the ASUS are 15 to 20% heavier. It uses an 8-pin power connection, and it also has the same 3 display ports and 1 HDMI port on the back. You also get no RGB, no dual BIOS, but it does have the fan stop feature just like the other cards. But let's look at performance. So I'm going to do a super quick recap of the chip itself because I talked about it so much in my other 4070 videos. And compared to the previous generation RTX 3070, the 4070 is about 23 to 25% faster depending on the resolution, which puts it pretty much in line with the RTX 3080. It is a 1440p card, and if we look at the 29 games in this graph, it manages to hit 70 FPS or more in every single title without any upscaling. But if you enable DLSS and frame generation, you get 100 FPS or more in every single title, and you even bypass some CPU bottlenecks like in the Microsoft Flight Simulator. At 4K resolution, the RTX 4070 does well if you enable DLSS, hitting 60 FPS or more in all 29 titles. But if you really care about 4K gaming and you want a card that will run every new game at high settings for a few years, getting a stronger GPU would be highly recommended. But at its targeted 1440p resolution, a 4070 Ti is about 22% faster and a 7900 XT is about 33% faster, and they both cost $800 or more. But the 4070 here is extremely power efficient, especially when you compare it to the 3080 and the 7900 XT. So, depending on how many hours per day you spend gaming and what are the energy costs in your region, this could make a big difference at the end of the year. But let's turn our focus back on these three entry-level models. In terms of boost speeds, all three cards are very close together. There's only 20 MHz between them, and technically, MSI takes a small win, but that's like less than 1% of a difference. And as usual, none of the cards come with overclocked memory out of the box, and if you want to, you can overclock it yourself. Those tiny clock speed differences lead to a single FPS gain here and there, but realistically, nothing that would make a difference and nothing that you would ever notice if you were to pick any of these cards. Power consumption is the other way around, with the MSI using the most, while the ASUS card uses the least amount of power. And a 10 watt or 5% of a difference in power is pretty significant, especially if you're in the EU with high power rates. Or at least it is more significant than a 1% clock speed difference. Out of the box, the MSI is the quietest, with the ASUS in its default BIOS right behind it. To be fair, the Gigabyte is still pretty quiet, but you can hear the smaller fans running at a higher RPM, which makes it just a bit more audible than the other two. If you want to go even quieter, the second BIOS on the ASUS runs the fans even slower, making it significantly more quiet. If we look at the temps, the Gigabyte shows the best numbers with significantly lower memory temperatures in particular, but it did run louder to make that happen. Between the MSI and the ASUS runs a few degrees cooler while the noise levels were pretty close, so I would say that the ASUS card is ever so slightly better if all you care about is efficiency. In its quiet BIOS, the hotspot and the memory temps were approaching 80 degrees, so in my opinion, the default performance BIOS offers the best balance between thermals and noise. So in most ways, these three GPUs are pretty similar. They share the same power connectors, same I/O connections, and lack of any flashing RGB lights. None of them run really loud or run too hot. None of them had any coil whine, and looking at both US and EU prices, they all cost exactly the same. So in my opinion, if you wanted to pick one based on looks alone, they would be completely fine. Because you literally have to start nitpicking to find any real downsides to any of these cards. But MSI did choose to save on the backplate by making it plastic instead of metal, and Gigabyte did decide to run the fans a little bit louder than I personally think it's needed. I cannot really nitpick anything with ASUS. It includes a BIOS switch for the same price, it uses a few watts less, and I think the balance between noise and thermals is pretty well done. So I would say that card has a very tiny slight edge for me personally, but if you prefer the color scheme of the Ventus card, or you need a card that is less than 2 slots thick, you could just as well go with the MSI. Or if you would rather have your card run a bit cooler instead of quieter, or it fits your case and your build a bit better, you can also go for the Gigabyte card. They're all completely fine. The more important and more fundamental question that you need to ask yourself is how much of a hurry you're in to buy a new GPU right now, because both the RTX 4060 Ti and the sub $500 GPU from AMD are supposed to launch in the next few weeks. So if a 4070 is already stretching your budget, a little bit of patience might pay off. This video is brought to you by Seasonic and their brand new Vertex power supplies. These fully modular power supplies are extremely efficient and very quiet due to their fan design and their hybrid fan mode that stops the fans completely under 40% load. They come with a variety of connections for any kind of systems you have in mind, including the new 12-volt high-power cable for the latest RTX graphics cards, and as a little bonus, you get a cozy 10-year-long warranty. Check them out using the links in the description below. I hope this video was helpful enough. If you enjoyed it, do give it a like. And if you want to make sure you never miss my future uploads, do consider clicking that subscribe button as well. Thank you all for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!